Welcome to the Implementing SAFMRs in the HCV Program webinar. Today's webinar will cover the implementation of small area fair market rents in the HCV program. This material was prepared by CVR Associates Incorporated. A member of the CVR team will be presenting today. Michael Tonovitz has more than 30 years of public housing experience with extensive knowledge of CMAP requirements, HUD guidelines, and HCV regulations. Michael?
Good afternoon, everybody. Appreciate you taking the time out of your day to participate in this webinar. The agenda today, I want to emphasize this is going to be a high-level overview of how you can successfully implement small area FMRs. It's going to have a particular focus on implementation for PHAs who are part of the 41 new mandatory areas. So we're going to talk about some initial analysis you should be doing if you haven't already started, how to implement your payment standards, how to update your policies, key communications, and next steps after SAFMR publication. And I will just start with saying those next steps should happen soon because the 2025 SAFMRs have been published. At the end, we are going to take questions, and if we will try to get to every question, but if we don't, there will be a Q&A document published after this webinar, and it will be posted to the HUD Exchange. So I want to start with a very high level overview. I'm sure most are aware, but for those who are not, SAFMRs are fair market rents, but they're established at the zip code level. There's currently 65 designated metropolitan areas for which it's mandatory to use SAFMRs. 24 of them started doing this in 2018, and there's another 41. And one thing I want to reiterate, if you don't remember anything else I said today, remember this. I personally have been through several conversions back in 2018, and with one PHA in particular, and it was for us a very stressful time. It seemed like there was a lot of uncertainty. And what we learned from the process was it was not as daunting as it seemed. So I just want everyone to remember that it seems like it's going to be a real challenge to implement and manage going forward. But our own experience has been that once you get your payment standards set up, once you get your systems working properly, that it's business as usual and it's not that bad. I also want everyone to know the HUD has put a lot of information out on the HUD Exchange. We could not possibly cover everything there is to discuss about SAFMRs in this webinar. So would encourage everyone to go to the HUD Exchange. There's some key things. There's a virtual convening. It was a 4-hour convening that talks about the history and policy behind SAFMRs. Takes a pretty deep dive into the two key PIH notices that pertain to small FMRs, and those are PIH notice 2023-32 and 2018-01. And in particular with 2018-01, what is relevant are the sections for mandatory SAFMR implementations. There is also a schedule of office hours on the HUD Exchange where we do dive into very specific topics in more depth, such as administrative policies to address changing payment standards, how to determine the best ways to determine payment standards, analysis of financial impact of implementing SAFMRs. HUD has also placed several case studies on the HUD Exchange, and there is a guidebook. It is being updated, but even in its current iteration, it is very good. Also want everyone to be mindful that SAFMRs do impact CMAP. They impact CMAP directly impact 4 indicators, and actually do have tentacles into other indicators such as indicator 2 for rent reasonableness and indicator 3, so making sure that ultimately that you have properly calculated the family share of rent. But the direct impacts come to lease up because implementing SAFMRs it is going to affect your payment standards and therefore your HAP costs. And ultimately, it would have an impact on your funding utilization, also your voucher utilization, which is one of the key reasons you need to be thoughtful about properly setting your payment standards. Also, using SAFMRs has been shown to expand housing opportunities. There are lots of studies that do show that using SAFMRs, they are an effective tool to expand housing opportunities in low poverty areas. So this can contribute to your score for indicator 7, as well as potentially open up an opportunity to get the deconcentration bonus. And as I mentioned, probably most importantly, as you implement SAFMRs, you're going to need to make sure that all of your payment standards remain in the basic range, or that you have the proper approval for any exception payment standards that go outside the basic range. So as soon as possible, please get started on analyzing the SAFMRs. They were very recently published and are on HUD user. It is mandatory that the affected PHAs start using SAFMRs starting October 1, and you must have adopted payment standards using SAFMRs that go into effect no later than the end of this year. So that's one of your first things you need to do is look up what your payment standards are going to be by zip code for your jurisdiction. Also, if there are any PHAs here that are in non-mandatory areas, please note that HUD does publish advisory small area FMRs for all communities, including non-metropolitan areas, and those are also available on HUD user. So this is just an example of what you would see if you went to HUD user. This is the example of Glendale, California, and it shows the range of payment standards by zip code. When you are looking up your own PHA, this is a great starting point to compare your current FMRs to the smaller FMRs. That will give you an idea of where payment standards potentially could be going up or could be going down, depending on each zip code and where the SAFMR is set in comparison to the FMR. As you analyze and develop your initial payment standards based on SAFMRs, as I mentioned, begin by comparing your FMRs to the small area FMRs to identify where changes are going to occur, and also where your payment standards are likely to be consistent with where you've currently set them and likely to still be in the current basic range. You may want to do, depending on the size of your jurisdiction, we've seen huge housing authorities with hundreds of zip codes that are being impacted, but there are others that are smaller. In 2018, there was one PHA that we worked with that only had one zip code. So your analysis will depend on the size of your jurisdiction, because you may want to be looking at how to develop payment standards, not only by zip code, but how you want to set them within a particular city or county. In some cases, you may want to be looking at the census tract level. If you have a community that has some census tracts that have wide ranges of rent between one end of a census tract and another, and you also will want to be looking to see if it makes sense to group certain zip codes together so that they all have the same payment standard. This is a way to manage your payment standards and have, even if you have a lot of zip codes, maybe to have a smaller group of payment standards. And last but not least, it is really important that your payment standards are set in a way that it's not going to create a rent burden, so that as you implement the SAFMR based payment standards, that you're not going to create a situation where families are going to be outside of that 30 to 40% of their income as their family share. There are some initial financial projections you're going to want to do as part of your analysis. And if you dive into this and you feel like you need more help and that you would benefit from some one-on-one assistance, contact your field office. There is a process where PHAs can be referred for one-on-one technical assistance. But there are also some great tools available on the HUD website. I'm sure everyone's already using the 2-year tool, which can be used to help project how leasing and utilization of funding will be impacted by the conversion to SAFMRs. Also, there is the HUD tool of tools, which allows you to assess different payment standard scenarios. It allows you to drill down into your PIC data and get very granular on the impacts of SAFMR based payment standards. And it does allow you to analyze how those scenarios might affect housing and housing cost burdens. So again, these tools allow you to project both voucher utilization and funding. And with that said, I am going to turn it over to our guru, Jonathan Zimmerman, who understands how to use these tools and how to use them to project cost and determine your payment standards. And Jonathan is part of Section 8 Associates based in Washington, D.C., and he has more than 35 years experience with the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So Jonathan?
Thanks, Michael. PHAs may have noticed in working with HUD's 2-year tool that embedded throughout it are humorous, lighthearted, and quirky sayings and pop culture references. Patrick Hatch, Chad Ruppel, and HUD's folks at the Program Support Division, Office of Housing Voucher Programs, have designed a number of tools which I reference in today's presentation, each which are the right tool for the job at hand. They've also created short training videos on every aspect of each tool and posted them on HUD's HCV Utilization Tools webpage. Come to PHA conferences to train on them, made themselves available to PHAs to answer questions, and have added further enhancements along the way. In this humorous tradition, which is all in service to essential work with PHA's federal voucher programs, HUD's 2-year tool hat has been placed on my head to help signify that I am one of its little helpers in a worthy cause to help make PHA's work easier and happier. So 2-year tool and payment standard tool, you see the acronyms there. SAFMRs may either increase or decrease housing assistance payments due to changes in payment standards in small areas. PHAs can examine available HAP funding in the 2-year tool, taking into account their possible HAP renewal funding inflation factor. With the exception of fiscal year 2024, HUD typically provides estimated HAP inflation factors in the 2-year tool in late summer, early fall. And these estimates are usually quite close to the final inflation factors. I anticipate HUD doing so again this year. PHAs can also compare SFMRs for each zip code where voucher holders live to the metro area FMRs. PHAs can use the 2-year tool and payment standard tool to test payment standard levels in specific zip codes or groups to see the impacts on per unit cost and their overall spending. PHAs can analyze rent burdens using the payment standard tool and see how payment standard changes impact the percentage of income that families pay for rent. PHAs can transfer monthly voucher HAP projections from the payment standard tool into the 2-year tool's manual PUC override field and run multiple scenarios. This is a screenshot of worksheet tab within the 2-year tool. You see the title there, it's called PUC.RB for per unit cost rent burden. You click on that worksheet tab at the bottom left of the 2-year tool, scroll all the way to the right, and what you see is that blue button. You click on it, and it's designed to help PHAs develop ideas on how they want to set future payment standards. This is what comes up with 3 columns added to the right and 2 rows added to the bottom by PHAs. By zip code, the spreadsheet provides a comparison of 2-bedroom FMRs and SAFMRs, the percentage difference between them, the number and percentage of voucher-assisted families across all bedroom sizes. PHAs can add 3 columns to the right by adding formulas from the FMR and SAFMR data for possible payment standard comparisons and the percentage difference between those values. After sorting the column titled Maybe SAFMR Exception between No and Yes, PHAs can add 2 rows at the bottom to include averages of the rows with No and the rows with Yes to get an idea of the percentage of families living in moderate to lower cost zip codes in rows labeled no, as well as moderate to higher cost zip codes in rows listed as yes. In the last column to the right, PHAs can get an idea of the percentage differences by zip code between FMR and SAFMR-based payment standards. For PHAs currently using FMR-based payment standards at uniform percentages across their service area, the results would be the same for all other bedroom sizes, 0 to 4 bedroom and beyond, as is shown with the 2-bedroom comparisons above. In this PHA example, 97% of voucher-assisted families reside in moderate to low cost zip codes, where FMR-based payment standards at 110% FMRs average 10% greater than the 110% of SAFMR-based payment standards and 28% less in moderate to higher cost zip codes. This is an important first step in the overall assessment process to help PHAs determine, one, their discretionary policy for existing families in their assisted units, where SAFMR-based payment standards may feature decreased amounts, 2, the initial percentages to apply to SAFMRs, and 3, ways to expand affordable housing opportunities to relatively higher cost zip codes within their overall HAP funding availability. Payment standard tool is, as Michael showed on the earlier slide, a tool that's within the tool of tools listed on HUD's HCV utilization tools webpage, and it can be used to project future per unit HAP cost and rent burdens for voucher assisted families. PHA can model its possible future SAFMR-based payment standards to balance its voucher program goals and regulatory requirements in mandatory SAFMR area to utilize its HAP funds and avoid going into shortfall. So inputting proposed payment standards. Within the payment standard tool, PHAs will be presented with a series of options on payment standards by zip code, city, etc. For PHAs with more than 20 zip codes in their service area, after grouping them within 20 groups, for purposes of using the payment standard tool's features, they can then select other as an option that allows them to use multiple payment standards. PHAs can use the data that they've created in their spreadsheets of SAFMRs from huduser.org and calculate whether they want to vary the percentage of those SAFMRs, or use an across the board percentage for all zip codes. And that could either be within their basic range of 90 to 110%, or an exception payment standard above 110% that they've secured with HUD. So once you come up with your SAFMR-based payment standards, 0 to 10 bedrooms, you can copy and paste that information right here into the payment standard tool. You see there are line items, 3 line items by zip code. And you see there's the blue lines that say current, year 1, and year 2. The current line and year 1 for all PHAs that are going to be, for example, setting their SAFMR-based payment standards for the first time as of January 2025. We'll go ahead and put their current payment standards on the current line, the same values on year 1, and then on year 2 payment standard line, that's where you're going to copy and paste your initially proposed SAFMR-based payment standards. I recommend that PHAs, when you paste that information into this, you paste them as values rather than using the standard default paste function, just to make sure that the macros aren't interfered with in the payment standard tool. The other thing is you have the option of putting in that FMR or SAFMR information. You see the same information for the 3 lines. If it's helpful to you to show what the percentages that you're going to be using as payment standard values. However, for the payment standard tool to make its calculations, including that information is not required. So if you have a lot of zip codes and you don't want to take that extra time, don't think you're going to get additional benefit, just go ahead and complete the 3 payment standard lines. Make sure you got 0 to 10 bedrooms all the way through in order for the payment standard tool to work. So reviewing the payment standards analysis. This is a screenshot, and you'll be able to examine the rent burden by bedroom size currently and at the end of the following year after 12 months of implementation. HUD has the authority under the regs to review PHA's payment standard for a particular unit size and geographic area if 40% or more of such families occupying units of that size currently pay more than 30% of their monthly adjusted income towards their share. And in the screen example, you see currently 19.4% of families meet that. Post implementation of SAFMR based payment standards, you see it's 14.4. And then down below in each of the rows by bedroom size, you could see what the distribution is. None of them meet or rise above that 40% threshold described, and so they are in compliance. So this one is the same screenshot, but more detailed, with the difference being on the left-hand side, you see two separate zip codes. In the payment standard tool, there's an orange button that reads rent burden, area bedroom size. You click on it, and it again provides you that same information, but a more granular level at zip code. And that's a key component to make sure that whatever payment standards you're going to adopt, ultimately the outcome is going to comply with HUD's regulatory requirement. So the payment standard also shows the estimated per unit cost change for the next year, which is highlighted there, 2025. And that results from your proposed SAFMR-based payment standards. This example is for a PHA that chose January 1st, 2025 as this effective date. After inputting the SAFMR payment standards assumptions, which we're going to talk about next, and the effective date, PHAs will transfer these per unit costs on the screen into their two-year tool as shown in a future slide. HUD's payment standard calculations apply to payment standard decreases at the household's second reexamination following that decrease, and obviously no earlier than 2 years from that time. Regardless of any PHA's administrative plan policy, such as a hold harmless, but with one caveat, and that is that families with reexaminations before the proposed effective date of a new payment standard will be brought to the current payment standard value, which may be a decrease. So after your PHA inputs SAFMRs, payment standards, and 3 assumptions and effective date, you can enter the per unit HAP cost results into the two-year tool. On the lower right-hand side there, you see there's 2 in the orange box, program-wide and PUC change type. Program-wide to the right is including both tenant-based and project-based. And then there's another option with a pull-down arrow that will say non-PBV, otherwise known as the tenant-based voucher program. You could pull that down if you just needed the tenant-based. But the program-wide option is the option used for PHAs that have both programs, tenant-based and project-based, because it lends itself to creating weighted per unit HAP cost averages in the two-year tool. This was the aforementioned other section of the payment standard tool. On the bottom there, you see the effective date you're going to use and 3 assumptions. The first one being, what do you project to be the annual % change of contract rents over the next 12 months, from the time your effective date of SAFMR payment standards? The next one, utility allowance and tenant income. How do you go about getting that information? There's a number of ways. You can use your pick ad hoc query data, pardon me. You could use your software system if it is able to provide you with that information, or you can use the housing analysis tool, which is generated in the tools which accompanies the payment standard tool. Each of those methods provides you with year-over-year data in each of these factors, from which you can then put them in and generate what the percentage annual change is. If you're going to do this through pick ad hoc query data, the recommendation is you go to the effective date of action and sort it by year, create 2 separate spreadsheets, calculate the averages in these 3 columns between those 2 years, and there you're going to have your results. With one cautionary tale, in that contract rents are very difficult to project with a high degree of accuracy when dealing with the prior 2 years average rate of change. And so if you have other data sources that are more current or more reliable, Zillow being one of them, you can draw upon those sources for your areas to make that projection. So here is the proverbial handshake between the payment standard per unit hab cost on the left, which we just discussed, and the image of the 2-year tool projection analysis tab on the right. So this example was a January 2025 SAFMR payment standard effective date, and those are the per unit per month impacts. You can transfer that information into the manual PC override of your 2-year tool by manually entering a formula that just puts equals the previous month in question. So in this case, it would be December 2024 plus the dollar amount shown from the payment standard tool in this example, $6.61, and end that formula. And then the next one for February, you'd be adding $4.57 to the previous month of January, so on and so forth. And now you've got what the projections are for the year based on your initial SAFMR-based payment standards. This is the upper right-hand corner of the 2-year tool now that you've done those manual PUC overrides. And it helps you assess, obviously, what the impacts are going to be within your annual budget authority, including how many families will you be able to lease up in the year? What would your budget utilization look like for the coming year? You did the income to rent burdens in the payment standard tool, as well as trying to balance out goals and see to the extent that you're able to expand affordable housing opportunities in higher cost, higher opportunity neighborhoods. After you transfer that information and made that initial assessment, the other thing that you're going to need to do, as I had said at the very beginning, is make sure that you have a HAP renewal inflation factor listed in your 2-year tool, right? You don't want to assume zero revenue for the coming year. So as I said earlier, that information will be coming in the late summer, early fall, presumably. The other thing you need to do is to go ahead and model some voucher issuance in the voucher issuance field of the 2-year tool to see if possible that you can sustain at least an equal voucher lease up rate in the coming years you did in the past. And that will give you an apples to apples comparison. And then, of course, you're going to be able to assess what that looks like on your budget authority, your reserves, so on and so forth, based on what your voucher program goals are and what the initial results are. That's an opportunity for you to go back to the payment standard tool and make adjustments by modifying percentages across geographic area or bedroom size, which we're going to cover, rerun the per unit cost, rerun the rent burdens, and then export the results back into the 2-year tool. And through that process, you'll get to a sweet spot that best balances your PHA's overall goals within your overall funding. This is a nice transition slide into implementing payment standards, so we can go to the next slide. PHAs may adopt unique payment standard schedule for each zip code or create groups. Payment standards can be set by census tract, zip code, neighborhood, school district, city, county, or region. An area may be no smaller than a census tract block group. And for in-depth information on this topic, there's an upcoming office hours that you can register through HUD Exchange. It will take place on August 28th. Varying payment standards. As I had mentioned just moments ago, PHAs may use different payment standard percentages by bedroom size, or a single payment standard for their entire area, or varied payment standard for each part of an area, i.e. zip code, city, or county. And there's the regulatory citation to support it. Sticking with that idea, varying payment standard percentages among designated parts of SAFMR areas and bedroom size can be an important strategy in helping PHAs transition to SAFMR-based payment standards. These can also be part of a long-term strategy to fine-tune a PHA's payment standard amounts by submarket based on a range of factors such as the availability of rental housing versus home ownership, the rental housing supply versus the demand overall and by bedroom size, rental vacancy rates, public transportation, and other considerations. On the same general topic, in areas where great variation in rents across jurisdiction, PHAs should consider a variety of factors when determining how many payment standards to establish and at what levels, including whether there's identical or similar SAFMR values by zip code or differences in SAFMR values by zip code, as well as the annual percent changes of SAFMRs from one year to the next. Consider staying within the basic range of 90 to 110% or exceptions if secured with HUD. Examine how the system of record that the PHA has will process SAFMR-based payment standards, the unit availability of rental versus homeownership in group zip codes, PHA budget impacts relative to the total budget authority available, rent burden and access to low poverty, high opportunity areas, compatibility with the affordability calculators by payment standard areas, which I'll cover next, and practices at neighboring PHAs and PHAs with overlapping jurisdictions, of which there are a good number in the new 41 metro areas under HUD's 2024 mandatory SAFMRs. So to the extent you can communicate and collaborate with those PHAs, it will make doing business with the housing authority easier for both landlords and tenants. Balancing goals. PHAs are encouraged to balance the goals of increasing access to low poverty, high opportunity neighborhoods, and serving the greatest number of eligible households when making these decisions, while also understanding the potential impact on HAP cost and minimizing administrative burden and opportunities for error. Request an exception or stay in the basic range. So agencies should evaluate whether to notify or request exception payment standards from HUD, such as when payment standards in the basic range are too high or too low to achieve their program goals, or voucher success rates and housing cost burdens need improvement, or total HAP funding is available to maintain uniform percentages at exception payment standards. If the use of SAFMR-based payment standards results in a decrease for voucher-assisted households while the family continues to reside in the assisted units, PHAs have three options. Hold harmless. PHA uses the existing higher payment standard as long as the family receives voucher assistance in that unit. 2, policy called 2 years after effective date. The reduced payment standard may be applied no earlier than 2 years following the effective date of the decrease in amount of the payment standard. And 3, phase in. The PHA uses the lower payment standard amount to calculate HAP costs no earlier than 2 years following the effective date of the decrease in the payment standard amount, beginning at the effective date of the family's second re-examination. So HAP costs for new admissions, relocation, and port-ins. This is a different subset than the transactions we just discussed. PHAs must apply SAFMR-based payment standards for new admissions, relocations, and port-ins as of the implementation effective date. None of the considerations for policies affecting in-place households apply with these household transactions. And by that, in the previous slide, when we're talking about existing families under lease, the hold harmless policy or the 2 years after effective date of policy no longer apply if subsequently the payment standard amount exceeds the frozen payment standard amount, or the family moves, or there's a change in household composition. That essentially decontrols the policy, and you go ahead and implement the new SAFMR payment standard, and there's a series of options there. But none of those conditions apply to new admissions, reloads, and port-ins. Projecting HAP, this is just a summary recap of the more detailed information we discussed earlier. Exception payment standards above 110 up to 120. You could see PHAs must notify HUD that it meets at least one of the following criteria. Less than 75% of new admission families are successful in leasing, or more than 40% of families pay more than 30% of their monthly adjusted income towards rent share. The process for this has not been established yet, but will be made available by HUD in a pending PIH notice to provide greater details from the department's May 7, 2024 SAFMR rulemaking. Conversely, below 90%, HUD may consider a PHA's request for approval to establish payment standard amount that's lower than the basic range. They'll consider appropriate factors, including rent burden of families assisted under the program. Software. When evaluating housing management software and coordinating with vendors, PHA should ensure that multiple payment standards can be supported, whether that's individual or groups. 2, SAFMRs updates apply to PBVs if applicable, meaning that's what the PHA chooses. Conversely, if not, FMRs will be used for PBVs and SAFMRs for tenant-based vouchers, possibly being applied in the software system in the same zip code. 3, software that it adapts to the selected policy for the 3 payment standard decrease options previously discussed. Planning updates each year. Coordinate the time between when HUD publishes proposed SAFMRs, the time needed to make calculations if you're grouping them, and making sure that they stay within that group, being able to get them into the software system with the effective date of your payment standard implementation. PHAs usually start at least 90 days out in advance of their lease anniversary for annual re-exams. So for example, if you're doing a January 1st, 2025 date, October 1st would be normally when you would start that process. And that's the time frame generally that PHAs would be looking at. And affordability calculators. You want to communicate with vendors about SAFMR-based tenant housing cost affordability calculators, which tenants can use to determine whether a unit's affordable for a new lease up, not to exceed 40% of their monthly adjusted income. Such calculators can reduce administrative burdens on families, properties, and PHAs. A member of the CVR team will be presenting Nikki Allen, a senior associate. She has more than 20 years of HCV experience with extensive knowledge of several housing programs. Nikki, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm going to talk briefly about the admin plan and communication requirements and provide an outline of steps to take after the publication of the SAFMRs. First, let's review admin plan update requirements. PHAs implementing SAFMRs need to review their admin plans to ensure the following are included: the process that was used to establish and revise SAFMR-based payment standards, how a decrease in payment standard is handled for assisted families who continue to reside in their unit, the criteria used to determine the designated areas and their payment standard amounts, and if the SAFMRs will be applied to the PHA's project-based voucher program, if applicable. Some information to consider for project-based vouchers. The use of metropolitan area or small area fair market rents is not mandatory for the PBV program. However, the PHA's admin plan must state the selected option as to whether they are using it for PBV or not. If the PHA elects to use the SAFMRs for the PBV program, the policy must be uniformly applied to all PBV awards made after the effective date of the policy change. It can be applied to existing PBV contracts as long as the owner mutually agrees to the change. Be mindful that once the decision is made to use SAFMRs for that PBV site, it cannot revert back to a metropolitan fair market rent at that site. So what is the PHA communication requirements? Transparency between the PHAs, landlords, and tenants is vital to building trust. It is important to establish clear policies, communicate upcoming policy changes, and make information accessible. For reductions, PHA must notify the families in writing at least 12 months before the effective date of a reduced payment standard. It is a best practice for PHAs to also notify the landlord of the change and what it may mean for them. Sample materials such as website language, letters, admin plan language can be found on the HUD Exchange. So what happens after the publication of SAFMRs? PHAs will want to consider these 9 steps. First, you want to review the new SAFMRs, then determine the payment standards, whether they are going to be grouped or individual, update the PHA materials, enter payment standards into the PHA software system, make internal updates, implement quality control policies, establish PHA policies for when there is a decrease, monitor your financial impact, and monitor your success rate. In conclusion, I would like to provide information on where additional support and resources can be found and open up to a question and answer period. To learn more about mandatory SFMRs or any processes described during this presentation, you can participate in upcoming office hours, which are posted on the HUD Exchange, request direct technical assistance through your local field office, or join communities of practice partnering with mentoring agencies that have already adopted SAFMRs. PHAs can access the SAFMR page on HUD Exchange, which includes information discussed on this webinar, along with virtual convening, office hours registrations, case studies, SAFMR guidebook, a list of FAQs and answers, fact sheets, and implementation notices. Some other links for applicable resources such as PIH notices, the newly published fiscal year 2025 SAFMR data can be found on this presentation slide, which will be available when posted to the HUD Exchange. We would like to open up to the Q&A period.
Great. So as a reminder, please enter any of your questions into the Q&A panel. And we do have quite a few questions already, so I'll go ahead and get started. So one of the questions asks, can PHAs set some zip codes at 100% of the SAFMR and other zip codes at 95% of the SAFMR, or do you have to use 1% of SAFMRs for all zip codes?
Good afternoon. Great question. You can set your SAFMRs as long as they are in the basic range, the 90 to 110%, or outside that range with HUD approval. You can set those payment standards to vary by zip code, or you can group them together. So multiple zip codes have the same payment standards, or you can even be so granular that you are setting varying payment standards at the census tract level. So to summarize, you can use varying percentages in various portions of your program jurisdiction.
Okay, great. Another question, do you have to download PIC data to use the payment standard zip code analysis?
Jonathan, can you take that question?
Sure. No, you don't have to use PIC data for that analysis. You can use the 2-bedroom zip code analysis between FMRs, SFMRs, and payment standards using your downloaded 2-year tool. And in that PUC RB worksheet tab, you click on it, scroll to the right, and that blue button, you just open it up, and out pops your specific zip codes and your data and the number of families living in each, at which point you could just insert a few columns and rows and perform that analysis.
Okay, great. Next, we have a few zip codes that are in our jurisdiction and another PHA's jurisdiction. We are in the same MSA that is now required to use SAFMRs. Do we only worry about our SAFMR for that zip code, or is there a requirement to come to an agreement with the other PHA in the same MSA?
All right, I'll start. So I don't know who gets attribution, but somebody once said that all charity starts at home. And I say that because each individual housing authority is probably working with a different annual budget authority with a different per unit cost structure. So my initial advice is to go ahead and run the numbers within your PHA, and the neighboring or overlapping PHA will do the same to try to get to the best numbers possible. Having concluded that exercise, however, it is worthwhile to then communicate with each other and see where you settled out, and to see if there's a happy compromise in the SAFMR-based payment standards for the overlapping jurisdictions, so that you can have good and easy communications with landlords and tenants. But the analysis really, I think, should start at home, but there's no requirement. I thought your question was very good. There's no requirement. It's at the option and discretion of the PHA.
Okay, great. We also have a question that asks if anyone else gets a debug error when running the 2-year tool and tool of tools.
Yes, and I'm happy to take it, but I'm also happy to have others add on. So to deal with the macros in HUD's tools, first download it onto a flash drive or onto your desktop. Then click on that File Explorer icon on the bottom toolbar of your computer. For any of us over a certain age, it looks like a manila folder. Then after you've done that, click on and locate the tool that you just downloaded. You'll see the icon of it. Right click on that. It'll then drop down a series of options. You pick the last one at the bottom, properties, and you do so again. It might be options. It's the last option. You click on that. Then at the very bottom, you'll see a pop up, and it will have a little box at the very, very bottom that says unblock. You click that and hit apply and OK. Then go back in after it's saved, open it up, and it will work without any bug issues.
Okay, great. Our next question asks, does the 2-year tool include all zip codes or only ones where there are current participants?
It's a great question. I'm happy to start, have others join in. So it's the latter, only where voucher assisted households reside. And so I believe the data that's currently in there has data from May 2023. So if there are other zip codes where currently there were no voucher assisted households residing there, what you can do in that same to your tool, PUCRB tabs, where you opened up that detailed SAFMR analysis, is it opens up and initially filters data for based on your PHA code and where folks are living. However, it contains the universe. So all you do there is just undo the filter, and it will literally have every zip code in the country. Go ahead and find the additional zip codes where that apply to your service area, but where no voucher holders reside. And then you can literally copy and paste that information back into the 2-bedroom comparison and go ahead. But your point is really important, because you ultimately want to adopt SAFMR-based payment standards for all zip codes in your service areas, not just those where the voucher holders currently reside. So thank you.
Great. So our next question says that a PHA mentioned that they have 129 zip codes and 5 mandatory counties, but there are 2 zip codes that are not in the mandatory area, and they're unsure of how to proceed.
Well, good afternoon. For the zip codes that are not in the mandatory area, you would continue to set your payment standards based on the fair market rent. You would not have to use small area FMRs. You could opt in if you wanted to, and there are instructions on how to go about opting in to small area FMRs in PIH Notice 2018-01. But again, for those 2 zip codes outside of the mandatory area, you would not be required to use SAFMRs.
All right, our next question asks, should a PHA use the new 2025 FMR until it fully implements SAFMR within 3 months from October 1st?
That would actually just add an extra step for the PHA, because you have the new SAFMRs go into effect October 1, just like the new FMRs. So there would be no reason to use the FMRs on an interim basis. You should just proceed to setting your payment standards based on the SAFMRs.
Right? Awesome. Our next question asks, is it a common practice for PHAs to use 90% of the posted SAFMRs?
Any
Go ahead.
specific practice that is common or uncommon, each PHA needs to make decisions based upon the needs of its program. The payment standards can be set anywhere in the range. So if you think that the SAFMRs, you don't need to set them any higher than 90% of the SAFMR, that's fine. But there, again, there is no common or uncommon practice in this range.
Okay, great. Our next question asks, if you are an MTW and do not have the tool of tools, are there formulas or workaround analyses that you suggest?
Jonathan, can you take this question?
Sure. The first one is that all PHAs have access to the tool of tools by going to HUD's HCV utilization webpage, whether they're MTW or non-MTW. So I would highly recommend doing that because it's built and designed to perform the applicable functions. For anybody, what was the second half of that question, just in case I missed it?
It was asking, are there formulas or workaround analyses that you would suggest?
No, I would suggest using the payment standard tool because it's definitely built and designed for that. And even PHAs, as I had said in the presentation, that have lots of zip codes. There are ways to group them within 20 so that they can be imported in the pick ad hoc query report into the payment standard tool. So no matter how big or how small, MTW or non-MTW, everybody can use HUD's payment standard tool to perform what are very complex functions, but done in a very user-friendly way. And if I didn't answer your question, just go ahead and put something else in the chat. We'll make ourselves available to you.
Okay, great. Our next question is a little bit lengthy. It says, on the LSAFMR implementation checklist from the HUD Exchange, it states that when submitting the CMAP, enter each payment standard in HUD's website. This is a manual data entry process that will require typing each payment standard for each zip code. Our PHA has 200 payment standards. Do we have to manually enter over 800 payment standards as there are 4 payment standards for each zip code?
At this point in time, I guess we would have to, we may have to defer on this particular question. We were actually looking at this matter. Currently, we're not aware of anything that's been simplified with submitting CMAP for SAFMR, but it's certainly a concern that we can share with HUD.
Our next question asks, it seems that FMRs and SAFMRs appear to have had a much smaller increase in values compared to the previous time interval, last year compared with 2 years ago. Can this be explained?
So that's like a good and important question. There'll probably be a lot of analysis done, but theoretically, HUD has up on its website, huduser.org, a full explanation of its data sources and methods to determine both FMRs and SAFMRs in terms of the timeframes that it uses American Community Survey data, as well as 1-year ACS, and in the last 2 years and now 3, private sector data. It would have to be the underlying data in those sources just mentioned that ultimately led to a calculation with relatively smaller increases, but it's going to have to be analyzed, and it's in the Federal Register notices.
Great. Our next question asks, can you restate what you said on the reduction notice to tenants? So we send out notices if they would go down, but if we are holding harmless, educated them, it will affect them if they are staying in place or no change in household.
Let me start, but then Nikki, I'm going to turn it over to you to expand. I believe that there are going to be sample notices for all of the different situations posted on the HUD Exchange if they're not there already. But Nikki, I'm going to let you expand on how we will go about notifying tenants in a hold harmless situation.
So yes, there will be a sample letter on the HUD exchange. We would recommend that the notices to the tenants go out no matter what policy that you select, just so they are all aware and get the notice. But the hold harmless situation will pretty much explain to them on the notice what hold harmless is and that it will not impact them at the present time with the change.
I know it wasn't part of the question, but I would also like to just add, when you're using hold harmless, something you'll want to be mindful of is that now you may have some families who are held harmless at one payment standard and new families who are going to have their share of rent determined based on a lower standard. You could even have situations where rents that you couldn't that were previously approvable can't be approved because of rent burden rules. So it is something you need to be prepared for, not only in your formal communications, but for your informal communications with both the residents and owners.
Okay, great. Our next question asks, if a unit pays taxes to a township, zip code A with a high payment standard, but has a mailing address from zip code B with a low payment standard, can I choose which one to use?
Well, the payment standard needs to be based upon the zip code where the unit is physically located.
All right. Our next question asks, do the new payment standards need to be effective 10/1/24, or can they be effective the beginning of the calendar year 1/1/25?
So the new payment standards need to be adopted no later than year end, so 90 days after October 1. The new effective date could be as late as January 1 of 2025.
Right, and our next question asks, for Ohio, the HUD website states that all PHAs in Ohio are mandated to use SAFMRs. If we choose not to implement these for PBVs, which payment standard do we use? We currently have HUD-approved success standards that expire in February of 2025.
In answering this question, I'm going to make an assumption that this question is pertaining to rent setting limits for the PBV program. So in the PBV program, if you're not going to use SAFMRs, then you would be using the the maximum rent that could be used in the PBV program is the higher of 110% of the area-wide FMR, or if there's already a higher approved exception payment standard, which there appears to be in this case, you could still go up to that higher amount for your PBV units. So I think we have time for one more question. I apologize. I know there's a lot more questions.
We can do one last question. Do you find that when you make the change to the SAFMR payment standards, many landlords request rent increases that are now at the top of the SAFMR scale, despite the increased requests being exceeding large? If so, how do you combat or address such requests?
And that's a great question. And I know some housing authorities in the 2018 implementation did experience owners trying to make large rent increases. So the key here is twofold. The reasonableness rules still apply. So if a large increase is being requested, that amount still needs to be rent reasonable. But there also is another interesting piece of the CFR pertaining to reasonable rents and rent increases. It not only says that the rent increase must be reasonable, it must be consistent with the owner's private market practices. So if the owner is not, so you would have some room to say that the owner is asking for rent increases in a manner that they would not for their private sector tenants. It would be difficult to prove, but you may want to ask the owner to show you that that they're asking for similar rent increases for their non-assisted families, because otherwise you have to tread carefully, but you could have grounds to deny exorbitant rent increases.
Okay, great. Well, it looks like we are at the top of the hour, but please enter any remaining questions into the Q&A panel, and we will address all relevant questions in the SAFMR Q&A document. We would like to acknowledge HUD's support. This webinar was developed through HUD's Community Compass program, which is a program that provides technical assistance to PHAs and other recipients of HUD funding. Michael, would you like to conclude?
Yeah, I guess we'll say I just really wanted to thank HUD and thank all of the participants for taking the time to participate. And then I just would remind anybody who participated, please take advantage of all of the resources that are on the HUD Exchange. Take advantage of the office hours. And if you think you need some technical assistance, reach out to your field office. All right, thank you, and everyone have a great afternoon.